Your Excellencies, dear guests, friends, and colleagues, welcome to today's event commemorating 1 year of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. And we are today asking the question, is justice possible? I am Kjersti Fløgstad. I'm the Executive Director at the Nobel Peace Center. And I have the privilege of welcoming you here today on behalf of the Peace Center and our partners on this event, the Ukrainian Embassy in Norway and the University of Oslo. A special thanks to Dr. Lilia Huncharevsky, Charge d'Affaires at the Embassy of Ukraine to Norway, who has tirelessly been traveling around in Norway these last few days to make sure that we don't forget the incredible sufferings and heroic sacrifices to the Ukrainian people these days. And I'm sure you have succeeded very well, Lilia, as there have been a lot of support and solidarity in Norway. And a special warm welcome to Sasha Romantsova, the director of the Ukrainian human rights organization Center for Civil Liberties. Center for Civil Liberties was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize in December last year, together with Memorial and Ales Bialetsky. Center for Civil Liberties were established in 2007 as a human rights organization. But the last year, you have been mostly working on documenting war crimes towards Ukrainian people. And this shows how important it is for society to have robust civil society organizations, and what role organizations as CCL can play in times of crisis. We are looking so much forward to hearing you talk more about your important work later. This event is part of the Nobel Peace Center's Nobel Peace Talks, with topics related to the Peace Prize awarded in December last year. So there will be several of these kind of events coming up now in the spring. And now I want to introduce my good colleague Ingvild Bryn Rambøll, who is the head of information at the Nobel Peace Center, and she will walk us through this today, and you're also responsible for our series of Nobel Peace Talks. So please give Ingvild a warm hand.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Kjersti, and thank you all for being here. And for those of you who are following this live, we are at the Domus Biblioteka at the University of Oslo. Welcome, everybody. And let's just get started. I want to introduce our first speaker, Lilia Huncharevsky, Charge d'Affaires at the Ukrainian Embassy in Norway. Lilia, the floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Today is 368 days of horror, missile from the east, north, south, sky, land, and sea. 368 days of nightmares, horrible losses, and desperation. We have changed tremendously for this one very long year. We are no longer the same. We became unbreakable. We became the still men and women with hot hearts. We create masterpieces in the shelters. We educate children by candlelight. We played concerts and footballs under the light of car headlights. Our children lost their childhood. Just imagine the child who spent 4 months in the shelter under the shelling without leaving the underground, or a girl who died because of the heart attack because she couldn't tolerate any longer the pain. Or a child who, after the shelling, asking his sister, could we sew the mother head and arms that were turned out so that she could speak and play again? Can you imagine the feelings of the parents who has seen his only child being raped by Russian criminals, or a political prisoner tortured by taking away the teeth and fingers by players? And this happens in the heart of Europe today by the permanent member of the Security Council. 16,000 deported children, 20,000 in captivity, around 5 million without housing, 500 historical and cultural buildings destroyed, and many people killed. Only today, 14 drones, kamikaze, were flying through 11 regions of Ukraine. 11 of them were shot by Ukrainian anti-missile system, but 2 of them were targeted on purpose our rescue services. Several people died. If we would have today the long-range anti-missile, we could save them. 6 months ago, Russia carried out a horrific terroristic attack in Olenivka. We won't allow the crime to be forgotten. We remember every killed Ukrainian warrior, and we are working hard to punish all those responsible for their death. The perpetrators will be found and will be brought to justice. The launch of a special tribunal is a way to prevent the crimes. We couldn't stop Holodomor 90 years ago, but we couldn't stop the genocide of Ukrainians that we have today. Accountability is a key to restore the justice and prevent the world from future wars. The question is now not whether we will win, the question is when we win. Democracy and human rights are values that we hold in high esteem. Justice will prevail, and we will not give up. Ukrainians are receiving Nobel Peace Prizes in the time of war. Nobel Peace laureate are calling the world to weapon the democracy. The children are fundraising and fundraising to bring the victory closer and donate to the army. I would like to finish by underlining that the Nobel Peace Talks, 1 year of full-scale war against Ukraine, is just as possible, is the last event in the series of events co-hosted by the Embassy of Ukraine to the anniversary of the full-scale war of Russia against Ukraine. Exhibitions, discussion with the Prime Minister and students in the academic quarter in Bergen, the solidarity marches Norway together with Ukraine in Oslo and Bergen, the concert on the charity concert on the full-scale war of Russia against Ukraine at Bergen Cathedral, the screening, the international conference War Against Ukraine in Bergen, the open event for Ukrainians in Norway City Hall, in Oslo City Hall, an action of solidarity with Ukraine in the Schilder Performing Arts Center in Kristiansand. And as the Prime Minister said, he is impressed by Ukrainian resilience, courage, and self-sacrifice. Ukrainians are fighting every day, every minute of their life for freedom and democracy through lost childhood, pain, losses, and sufferings. We must make sure that this year becomes the year of victory of Ukraine and the whole democratic world. More weapon, recognition of the genocide of Ukrainians, establishment of the special tribunal, NATO and EU membership, implementation of peace formula, and many more are on the agenda. We don't have the right to stop. If Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine will cease to exist. By this, I would like to introduce Astrid Bergmål from the Ministry of Justice of Norway, and I would like to thank the Norwegian government for all the support and solidarity for Ukraine. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Giving us the possibility to be a part of this this day and this being together today. 1 year ago, the world watched in horror as Russia invaded Ukraine, a European sovereign democratic state. The 24th of February 2022 marks a watershed moment for Ukraine and for Europe, as Russia started the biggest war on the European continent since the Second World War. We have since been witness to the heroic will, immense endurance, and great ability of the Ukrainian people in defending their country. I have been fortunate to meet and talk with Ukrainian colleagues, and these moments I have greatly appreciated. Our conversations had really made a deep and lasting impact on me. I'm standing here today to share with you the Norwegian government and my own wholehearted and committed support for the Ukrainian people in their fight to win this war, and to demand accountability for illegal actions of Russia. We stand together with every Ukrainian child, woman, and man as they continue their legitimate fight to defend themselves. Norway strongly condemns Russia's aggressions against Ukraine. The full-scale invasion constitutes a gross violation of international law, including the UN Charter. Russia must abide by the order of the International Court of Justice and immediately suspend its military operations in the territory of Ukraine. Russia chose to start this war, and Russia must now choose to stop it. Our support for Ukraine remains steadfast. The Norwegian government has recently launched an unprecedented support package for Ukraine of 75 billion Norwegian kroners over the next 5 years. The long-term nature of the program gives predictability, I can't say that word today, for Ukraine, and demonstrates our firm commitment. We will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We are appalled by Russia's methods of warfare. Numerous credible reports have described in horrible detail the violent attacks and unimaginable atrocities committed against civilians. Thousands of civilians, including children, have been killed. Millions have fled their homes, often separated from their loved ones. There are clear and abundant indications of systematic and massive-scale war crimes being committed by the Russian armed forces and their proxies. Unspeakable horrors have been revealed in places previously under Russian occupation. Civilians have been forcibly transferred to Russia and Russian-occupied territory. There are reports of children being transferred to Russia and adopted by Russian families without the consent of their parents. And there are disturbing reports of sexual violence being used as tactic of war. These atrocities shock the very consistence of humanity and must be condemned in the strongest possible terms. Violation of international law cannot go unchallenged. All reports of atrocities must be properly investigated and the perpetrators of any crimes be brought to justice. There can be no impunity. Accountability is vital to ensure justice for the victims and to deter and prevent further violations. Perpetrators must be held to account through national or international criminal justice mechanisms. That is why the Norwegian prosecuting authority decided to open investigation into possible war crimes committed in Ukraine in March last year, and the National Criminal Investigation Service, the NCIS, are in the process of gathering evidence. They do this by identifying witnesses and taking their statements, by securing photos and videos, by using open source intelligence, and by cooperating with other relevant stakeholders, both national and international. Moreover, Norwegian investigators are also seconded to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, in order to work with and contribute to the ICC's own investigation. Norway also joined several other countries in referring the situation in Ukraine to the ICC in March of last year, and furthermore, we are intervening both in the case brought before the International Court of Justice by Ukraine concerning Russia's breaches of the Genocide Convention, and in the case brought against Russia in the European Court of Human Rights. Norway is glad to have joined the core group on accountability for the crime of aggression. We want to contribute to ensure cross-regional support for a solution that provides accountability, while at the same time does not undermine the ICC's ongoing investigation of war crimes committed in Ukraine. Democracy, rule of law, and human rights are essential. They are our best tools for promoting peace between states and accountability at all levels. They are also what we have to build on when we turn our back on war and destruction. We must defend these norms and standards and the value that underpin them. We will speak up for international law and take action for all people in need who are affected by this war, no matter where they are. Because this war of aggression is an attack not just against Ukraine, but against the principle and values that underpin our society. The Ukrainian people are giving their lives to defend these universal values and their own independence. And Ukraine can support on Norway's continued support in this struggle. I want to thank you all very much at the Ukrainian Embassy and the Nobel Peace Center for organizing this important event. I'm really looking forward to listening on today's intervention and to learn from today's discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Astrid Bergmål, State Secretary of the Justice Department, for setting the frame of today's discussion. And thank you also for representing the Norwegian government at this event. Now we shall hear from a politician representing the Ukrainian government. Dr. Anton Korneyevich is Ambassador at Large at the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, and he coordinates the establishment of the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine from the Ukrainian side. He was not able to be here in person today, but he has sent us his speech by video. So please listen to Anton Korneyevich.
Dear colleagues, distinguished experts, it is a great pleasure and honor to talk today to you on the issue of accountability for the core international crimes committed in Ukraine during the Russian aggression. The Russian Federation started the brutal war of aggression against Ukraine in February 2014 and has another stage of this aggression started in February 2022 with a full-scale invasion to the territory of Ukraine. These 9 years have been marked by the brutal mass atrocity crimes, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide committed by Russian soldiers, Russian citizens in the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine uses each and every possible opportunity to bring perpetrators of those horrible crimes to responsibility. In particular, Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, Prosecutor General's office are very active in investigating and prosecuting and bringing to justice the perpetrators of these crimes. Also, Ukraine has recognized the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, and now the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC conducts investigation of the situation in Ukraine. We hope that this investigation will have deliverables, in particular indictments and arrest warrants issued to the citizens of the Russian Federation for commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in the territory of Ukraine. But using existing tools are not enough, because there are at least two gaps, two loopholes in the system of international accountability, when we talk about core international crimes committed in the territory of Ukraine. The first gap is the absence of the accountability mechanism for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Currently, there is no international court or tribunal which can bring perpetrators of the crime of aggression against Ukraine to responsibility. Therefore, we need to close this gap and establish a special tribunal which will be able to work to have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Ukraine is working effectively and actively on this issue for a year now, and we have already got political support from parliamentary assemblies of international organizations, from European Parliament, from national parliaments of our partner states, in official positions and in official statements by many governments, in the EU Council conclusions, in the resolutions which were adopted throughout the world. And we hope that we will succeed in our endeavor, in our effort, and the special tribunal will be established. It is important, while we are still in the process of finding the best possible ways and solutions for the establishment of the tribunal, it is important to make intermediary steps in order to have intermediate result of this work. So that is why it is important to have the establishment and the start of the work of the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine in The Hague this year, as it was announced that this center may start operations in July of 2023. This center will be linked to the currently existing joint investigation team and will be supported by Eurojust. This is a very important international effort which will concentrate on investigation of the crime of aggression against Ukraine with international support, with the help of international element, and we hope that this investigation may then form a basis for the work of the future special tribunal. It is also important to cover the second gap, which is the lack of the compensation mechanism, the international mechanism which may deal with compensations for damages and losses caused by the Russian aggression. And that is why it is important also to close this gap and to establish such a compensation mechanism with the establishment of the register of damage, which will register the claims of natural persons, legal entities, governmental entities, and then the future compensation mechanism will be able to use the applications from that register of damage. So in order to achieve full comprehensive accountability, we are sure that we need to close these two existing gaps in the system of international accountability. It is also important that Russian aggression against Ukraine and the horrible crimes which the Russian Federation commit against our people are not something new. Russians have already done this throughout the history. And I cannot make myself of this opportunity to try to talk and to bring to your attention the issue of genocide of Ukrainians, which now is being taken by the Russian soldiers, Russian citizens in particular, by deportation, forced transfer, forced deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. And that this genocide really looks as a continuation of the genocide which happened in 1930s, in particular in 1932, in 1933, in the form of Holodomor of Ukrainian people. The Russian Federation wages this war, which is targeted at annihilation of Ukrainian nation. And that is why it is important to recognize Holodomor as a genocide of Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian people, and also to prove the genocidal character of this war, which the Russian Federation now wages against Ukraine, against Ukrainian nation. I am sure that together with the assistance and support from our international partners, we will deal with this issue, we will handle with it, and we will be using, as we do now, all the currently existing tools and mechanisms and instruments to bring Russian citizens to responsibility for the core international crimes committed in the territory of Ukraine. And we will also do all that we can in order to close the existing legal gaps, legal loopholes in the accountability system, and to establish the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine and the international compensation mechanism. I thank you.
Thank you to Anton Korunevich, Ambassador at Large at the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, for very useful input to the discussion that we're going to have in a few minutes. But before then, I want to give the floor to our guest of honor today, Oleksandra Romantsova, Executive Director of the Center for Civil Liberties. Give her a warm welcome.
Oh. Hello. I'm really glad to be here and have a possibility because of University Oslo give it me, because of Nobel Peace Prize work for that, and because of Embassy of Ukraine really proactively organized even, looks like quite tour to different region of Norway. And that's why I want to just not only describe our work in Ukraine about documenting the war crime and exactly bringing the justice to hold the people who are suffering from war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of genocide, but to share some my thoughts after tour in 3 different regions of Norway. It's quite difficult being here in sunny Norway because I'm really lucky in this way, all the 4 days that was sunny, to understand how exactly people live now in Ukraine. From one side, it's quite easily than here, because in Ukraine you have only 2 opportunities, or rockets coming into your head and you just die, or you are working for victory. It's not only because we believe that we will be successful, because we don't have other choice. Like my colleague Anton Korunevich told about that long history of a struggle between Russian and Ukrainian vision of future. It's not about, it's not separate people because of ethnic, religion, language or other characteristic. It's separation between people who believe that they can be responsible for their lives, for their states. That's called democracy. It's not only rights, it's exactly responsibilities. And people who believe only in one way how we can live together, have some kind of leader of Tsar, who exactly will make some decision for us and need make, I don't know, some ideas of how to solve conflict between us or something like this. So it's 2 big differences. And 2 big differences called, if it's democracy, it's called Ukraine. If it's about be just a part of big country which exactly using their own resource, taxpayers, and exactly people for aggressive empire spreading, it's called Russia. Now, I really hope that in the future, if we help exactly healthy part of Russian society, like Memorial, my colleagues, will be majority, we have possibility to see other Russia. And it's first of all will be their responsibility. But now Ukrainians are responsible for our choice. Choice of democracy, rule of law, really human dignity, respecting area. We are only in the way, but only this area exactly afraid of Putin. Because in democracy, Putin will not have any power. Because in democracy, when Putin told you need go and make a war, nobody will come. Because it's not only one person exactly doing the war crimes, which I have a possibility to show you. Center for Civil Liberties started documented war crimes in 2014. That was personally my first project, like human rights defenders. Before that, I working in the bank. In same situation like now, mostly people who fighting for exactly frontline in Ukraine, it's teachers, IT specialists, some of them owners of businesses, some of them exactly, I don't know, ballet dancer. We have really great to lose one of the talented belly dancer who exactly go into army and die there. So it's ordinary people. And when we started documented war crimes in 2014, we see all the kinds of war crimes in Donbass and Crimea. And we're trying to scream for all the world that it will not stop. They will produce more if we will not give the justice for that. If we will not tell that it's not a norma have this in Europe or everywhere in the world. Because before Ukraine, before Donbass and Crimea, that was Georgia, Chechnya, Syria, Mali, Moldova. That's smaller country than Ukraine, less population, not so digitalized. That's why we don't see what they do in there. That's why only human rights defenders like memorials documented war crimes in two Chechen war. And that's why we don't have such big wave of support, because we don't see. Now in Ukrainian, you can say that you don't see these 33,000 of war crimes. Because human rights defenders, together with General Prosecutor Office, together with International Criminal Court investigation team, exactly documented war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of genocide, day by day. It's looked like exactly, I'm just trying to show you how it can be look like for you. We create such website, which exactly each of you can go in and look how many cases we have now. And again, we are not General Prosecutor Office, so we don't have all this access. So it's just the possibility of 32 human rights defender organizations who cover whole the territory of Ukraine. So why we do that? Because it gives us opportunity to show that it's not a change of one soldier made the war crimes. It's a war crimes which happen whole the territory of Ukraine. So inside the Ukraine, you don't have safety place, maybe in metro, only one version. So if you come somewhere, or if you're trying to find the place where your children can just graduate from school and you need it 4 years or something like this. Now in Ukraine you don't have it. So all of these cases, it's potential war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. Why potential? Because we exactly respect the possibility finally call this like a crimes for courts. And all of this showing that every time when we have a successful liberation of some such place like Kherson or my native Mykolaiv, here, it's my native town, Mykolaiv, and here, Kherson, where do you see this part upper? It's now liberate. And what does it mean, occupation? That not means you just change the flag. That means that every day in the non-liberate part, this one down, war crimes happen. Every day people raped, killed, kidnapped, forcibly illegally detained, or forcibly replaced. Like one of the example here, Oleksandra sons. It's only one desert exactly in Europe. We have them in Ukraine. And here exists Oleksandra children's house. It's orphan house with children with disability. My university supports this children's house more than 10 years. And exactly from there, children called me and told that Crimean doctors come to our place and will take us somewhere, we don't know where. So all of these children need to special caring. Some of them have relatives because special caring can be provided with relatives, but they exactly teach in there. 13 children were taken from there and put in Crimea exactly in psychiatrical hospital. They told we don't have other place. Why you exactly take the children where you decided to do that? So it's one of example how we worked. At the occupied territory, we're working with grassroots initiatives. We're working with the people who live there or people who escaped from there. So we collect all the information about potential war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of genocide. That show exactly before that you can find here, for example, hospitals. You know that one of the most protectable exactly objects in international humanitarian law, it's medicine objects. It's happened everywhere. So it's not a question that only one soldier, officer, or one troop decided that it's a good idea, take a hospital like a military object or exactly strike it. No, they do that systematically. That means this decision which was made upper in army and made even maybe upper in Putin's head. So when we speak about justice, it's first of all prosecute Putin and hold his management system around of him. We calculate it's near to 20% who exactly need to answer to their decision started war in 2014. That's called crime of aggression. For that, we need special tribunal, because like Anton Karenich told about that, we don't have any other international mechanism which cover it. But all other 1,000 cases, that means it will be long and big challenge for Ukraine. And that's why we need to support from you. First of all of this, it's a result that previous crime was not exactly punished. I speak not about previous crime of Russia Federation, but Russia Federation used like a best model, best practice, Soviet Union times. Not once Putin told about that Soviet Union times are the best examples, and Stalin, one of the best manager. But what exactly doing Stalin and what Putin trying to repeat now? Stalin deported Crimean Tatarians from Ukraine to the Central Asia, and 15% of this population dying during this exactly so-called deportation. And they don't have a possibility comes back to their native land more than 80 years. Stalin exactly creates such understanding like artificial hungering, which we call Golodomor. What that means, that was the tools how to take all the grain which Ukrainians, first of all, providing, like producing, growing in our lands, and sell it, change for industrial technology or something like this. But main idea that Ukrainians not resist, because we have this history of the resisting more than 300 years. So everywhere where in Soviet Union live exactly Ukrainians, artificial hunger was created specially by decision of Stalin. And still Putin used Stalin names like one of the best managers' names. So it's give opportunity Putin exactly providing new, like magnetic, I don't know, like hypnotic speech, and whole the population, 140 million Russians, mostly believe him. That is good practice what Stalin do. So now when they told about anti-nationalization of Ukraine, they told it's like same like Stalin do. So that's why it's so important such kind of good news for Ukrainians who now inside the Ukraine really touchable when from other country we see some kind of support. Such discussion like today, some cultural like historical events when we recognize some connection between Norway and Ukraine, or some really important for us politician decision like recognize of Golodomor, or support creating of separate international tribunal against the crime of aggression. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sasha. You may have a seat in the panel now for the discussion coming up. And thank you so much for giving this insight into the important work that you and CCL are doing on the ground in Ukraine. It's both very disturbing and very interesting to listen to you. Now I want to hand over the microphone to our moderator for the next session, Natalia Yeremeyeva. She is advisor at the European Wergeland Center here in Oslo. where she is project manager for the program supporting educational reforms in Ukraine. Please, Natalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ingvild, and thank you for this opportunity. It's an honor for me to moderate this discussion. And ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, honorable guests, please welcome 2 more participants who will join Sasha Romantsova in this panel. And this is Sofia Hauge, a researcher, law professor, political commentator, and a politician, and a member of the Liberal Party. Please. And we also would like to welcome Christian Tybring-Gjedde, a politician representing the Progress Party of Norway, who has been a member of the Norwegian Parliament since 2005. Please, welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of this seminar asks an important and complicated question. If justice is possible for Ukraine right here, right now, in the context of Russia's war, the war that started in 2014, not a year ago, well, as officially recognized by the, for example, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the war which started with the annexation of Crimea and occupation of parts of Donbass and culminated in a full-scale invasion in February 2022. And I suggest that we start this conversation by speaking about the concept of justice as it is. So I would like to address all our participants, and if we just can take a minute each to shortly define the term. How would you come with a definition? What does justice mean for Ukraine right now in the context of this war? Sophia, please.
Thank you so much. That's a big question, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a real honor to get to sit in a panel with you. My main research field is international criminal law. So if you ask me what justice is, I would say it's a broad, substantive, and in-depth prosecution of what I would call atrocity crimes, which are crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and the crime of aggression, but also other forms of transitional justice mechanisms, such as truth commissions. I think it's incredibly important to have a truthful narrative about what's happening in this conflict for a historical record, but also, in a larger perspective, as I think you so brilliantly ended on, what to do when this war ends. How do we get Russia to not be the Russia of today? How do we? I think about my grandfather, who was a prisoner of war during World War II. My parents actually met in Germany, and I don't know if I could have sent my kids to study in Germany if I'd been tortured in a Nazi prison, but he did. How do we do that long-term reconciliation process? And I think long-term reconciliation, a historical justice record, as well as prosecutions, to me, is justice.
Thank you so much. Very important division between political and historical justice, and we will come back to that. Christian, how do you understand justice for Ukraine?
Can you hear me now? Is it on?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. There's a saying that you should not do to others that you don't want them to do to yourself. And I think if you call about justice, I think most people would think of that as being just. If you don't do that, then it's I think it's justice. And how to be justice for Ukraine? I think it's a huge question, because it's you have to look at the who, when, where, how. You have 4 issues here, and no one has the answer yet. And if you look at or here to listen to the former speakers, they were very clear on what they looked at, what's justice. But that's a hopeful world. I'm not sure that you will ever get there, even though we all want to get there, that the ones responsible for the war crimes in Ukraine actually are being punished. I think I'll leave it at that, and I can continue later on with another question.
Excellent. Sasha, would you sum up this discussion? What is justice from the Ukrainian perspective?
For us, justice, it's, first of all, we have 2 parts. Prosecute perpetrators and exactly support the victims. Now, if we will speak how many victims we will have of war crimes, it's not only Ukrainians. Again, just back for this understanding, it's Chechnya, Georgian citizen of Moldova, citizen of Syria, Mali, and other African countries, which exactly because Russia creates such understanding like Wagner, and now they support non-democratical regimes in different countries of Africa. So we will speak about justice for exactly Ukraine. So for us, for Ukrainians, it's first of all Putin's at the jail, people who made this decision. Because one of the biggest shock for victims, it's find that people who see same cartoons like you, Soviet cartoons, like can fight with you, can exactly, you not attack them, but they shooting you. You not do nothing but to speak in Ukraine, and they tell that you are fascist. So this moment, people, first of all, think that responsibility for people who create this propaganda machine and who create this authority system. But as for me, I think how the people need to remember that it's not only Putin doing. That means we need have answer for who and how for each level of participation in these war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of genocide. So sure, as for me, Putin needs to sit in the jails, but I'm not sure that he will be alive. It will be accused him exactly personally. So for Ukrainians, he will not leave, and we don't have a possibility to arrest him and put him in Hauge. So exactly recognition, exactly decision of court that all what he doing, all these decisions, it's a crimes. It's really important for Ukrainians. It will be one of the main goal, because even perpetrators will be killed, and a lot of soldiers who made war crimes after they was killed by Ukrainian army in battlefield. So, but recognize it like a crimes, recognize that it's not a normal act like them even during the war. It's really important point.
Thank you, Sasha. Sophia, back to you. A year ago, in the morning of the 4th of February, you wrote in your Twitter account, let me just quote, "What we see in Ukraine now is a pure Russian war of aggression. War of aggression is an original crime in the modern international law. That is what the Nazis were punished for in Nuremberg in 1946. They were prosecuted and sentenced for having launched a war of aggression against a number of countries, including Norway." End of quote. And now, 1 year later, what do you think are the chances that Russia is going to be punished for its crimes in Ukraine?
That's a big question. I'm sure it's one we think about a lot. For me, that morning when I woke up to the invasion, I realized that it was on the day exactly 80 years ago since my grandfather was captured during the Second World War. And for me, it was so disorienting to wake up to these images that I'd never hoped to see in my lifetime in Europe or anywhere. But also, it was incredibly important to me that we started the discussion by using the correct labels. So crimes of aggression is a legal term for what Russia was doing by invading Ukraine. So that was trying to use my law degree to say this is actually, we have classifications for what's happening here, and we need to use the correct words. The big question of is justice possible in a long-term perspective? I think about what my grandfather would think if he was still alive today, and I think that he would say something along the lines of, in 1942, things weren't looking particularly bright in Europe. Things weren't looking particularly bright from a Norwegian perspective when we were occupied. But the long arch of justice came. And so while, if you ask me from a legal perspective, is justice in Ukraine possible? I would say absolutely. Today we have the legal tools to prosecute these kinds of crimes in a way that we didn't before the Second World War, and in a way that we didn't have enough experience with after the Yugoslav conflicts. But after the Yugoslav conflicts in the 90s, we resurrected international criminal justice, and we have quite a lot of experience with how to effectuate complex international criminal prosecutions. So we have a legal framework, and we have experience. The third question is the question of politics. Obviously, we've never ever prosecuted a sitting member of the Security Council for these kinds of crimes. That is a fact. But when I research these kinds of conflicts, what I see is that the arc of justice bends long. When I like to think of something more positive, I think of the case against the former dictator in Chad, who in the 80s made a regime of systematic torture of his own citizens. And I think no one in the 80s seriously thought he would ever be prosecuted for this. In the 80s, this was before the Yugoslav Tribunal, it was before a lot of these things in international criminal justice happened. But what happened was that when he in the end fled Chad and began an asylum process in Senegal, there were victim groups, civil society, who secured documentation of his torture centers. And that documentation was used 26 years later. It took 26 years to create a justice mechanism in Senegal, where the African Union came together and created a special tribunal within the courts of Senegal to prosecute him. But it happened. And no one would have thought that was possible in the 80s. No one would have thought that was possible in the 90s. No one thought that was possible when I lived in Senegal in 2005. It wasn't possible before it was possible, politically speaking. And that is the hope, and why I think this Peace Prize is so important, because it's groups like yours who are securing this evidence in real time, which will mean that we have the historical evidence that we need if this takes a very long time, if this is measured by decades. I hope it isn't. But if it is, that record doesn't go away. And I think that is what gives me hope in a long-term perspective, that if we measure this in a 25-year perspective, yes, I think many things that are not possible today will be possible.
Thank you. Very, very important comments. But getting back to political will. I was just thinking about Kamala Harris, US Vice President, was speaking at the Munich Security Conference, used very strong words to describe what is going on in Ukraine. Mentioning that it's clear that Russia must be held accountable for what she called the barbaric actions in Ukraine, and more or less stating that US formally sees Russia's actions in Ukraine as crimes against humanity. So this, it cannot be stronger than that. So Sasha, I will ask the next question to you. In the light of such declarations, do you think we will witness Vladimir Putin either in The Hague or in front of another special tribunal which is being created, or what are the chances then?
I think that mechanism, I'm really glad that we have this mechanism which exactly can punish the kind of crimes level of Second World War. But now we have a new kinds of war, exactly. Like International Institute of Wars, they told about that near the 35 wars we have around the world, and 13 of them exactly continue more than 10 years. And all of them have a hybrid form. What does it mean? We have economic part, we have information part, and we have military part. So when we speak about create new justice mechanism, we speak about exactly create mechanism which can punish war the level of 21st centuries, not like previous, like Second World War. Because Rwanda's case of radio of Thousand Hills show us that we can find arguments how exactly journalist or manager of radio can flew into the question how many people will be killed during the genocide. Because they just searched that whereas the radio signal was better, killing was much more, then whereas exactly in Rwanda they don't have the signal at all, like neighbors even from different ethnic groups support each other. So here, when we speak about like Putin responsibility, we speak about whole the system, like collective Putin, we call that, like responsibility. And one of these part, it will be new kind of war crimes. It's exactly a role of propaganda. In this way, it's state channel and management of state channels. And here we need to be really careful, like from one side, prosecute propagandists, from other side, not shrink the space for freedom of speech. So every time we need to have this balance, because exactly this case of Rwanda radio give us possibility to see how it can be. You need evidence for what you do in court, so it's really important. So when we speak about Putin, that's why it's so complicated exactly and so big challenge to find concrete orders which Putin signed, and after this hold the chain, like at the end, at the grassroots level, like by the hand of soldiers, they do the war crimes. So that's why exactly this special order about Ukrainians' adoption of Ukrainian children can be such chance to catch Putin concrete, because he signed it, special order. But all other way, like Putin don't like sign anything. From one side, from other side, in Russia army, exactly even like order by words, if legal, so we can catch in this moment if we will have some recording of telephone or something like that. So it will be not easy create a system which exactly can answer to some challenges now, but again, supporting this idea, it's impossible till it's not happened. Like possibilities, we use it. So we can wait of justice. We need made a justice.
Excellent. I see, Sophia, you would like to add something. And I also wanted to address this question to you to elaborate a little more on this particular mechanism of creating a tribunal for Putin. But maybe just speaking on that, you can also adapt a little bit how Norway can contribute to this process.
I think what you're talking about is really interesting, because I wrote my PhD on how you can prosecute top-level perpetrators, or what we, after the Second World War, called major war criminals, or those that we today call those who are the most responsible, such as state leaders for international crimes, because it's often not the case that it's difficult to prove that the crimes themselves have happened. You'll have lots of evidence to that effect, but that linkage evidence that you're talking about, that's really what international criminal tribunals struggle to get. And I think, unfortunately, that's one of the things that many regimes learn from the Second World War, is that unlike the Nazis, you don't document all the crimes, and you certainly don't sign things. And I think that makes these kinds of tribunals more difficult, based on that historical record. But I think that what's interesting now is that we have a lot of different processes going on. I think one of the more important things that Norway and other countries can contribute today is looking at ways that we can systematize this. Because I think, if you're asking me as a legal academic, that we're going to have many different ways of prosecuting these crimes, and they're going to be overlapping mechanisms. The ICC, for example, the International Criminal Court, they tend only to take out maybe 5 or 6 indictments in any case. They take the top tip of leadership. And then you have, sometimes you have special mechanisms under that who take the mid-level perpetrators. And then you often have domestic courts who will take the brunt of the cases. This is what happened in Norway after World War II. You had the trial of the major war criminals, none of them were Norwegian, at Nuremberg. And then you had about 90,000 cases investigated by our national authorities. Not all of them ended in a prosecution, but there are about 90,000 cases that were investigated after the Second World War. And so I think, realistically, in order to have a comprehensive justice, we have to look at how to use all of these mechanisms and coordinate them so that they are speaking together, and so that your evidence gets to the right people and are used in the right ways. And I think that is sort of a new challenge going forward. And that's something that Europe and Norway as well has been trying to work on, in terms of now setting up this Center for the Crime of Aggression in The Hague to start some of this work. There are different kinds of mechanisms at play. But of course, I think, unfortunately, and of course, prosecutors in Ukraine are already working on these cases. I think, unfortunately, it's a question of how do we fund the baseline prosecutions. There are going to be thousands of so-called physical perpetrators, soldiers on the ground, who will be implicated in war crimes. That's already been well documented. And then how do you get at the top levels? The top levels are very politically difficult. It might be less politically and practically difficult to get at this layer. But of course, no justice will feel comprehensive unless you get at this top tier. But it's maybe starting to get at this lower tier level of cases and coordinating European tribunals to do so. And Norway, as the State Secretary said, has already started investigating cases from a Norwegian perspective. If we were to get persons who have been involved in war crimes come to Norway from Ukraine, we could prosecute them under our laws. That was not the case in the 90s, that's the case now. So it's about really coming together and looking at how we can use different justice mechanisms together to get this comprehensive justice, understanding, as I'm sure you'll want to add, that getting at the top level Russian perpetrators here is going to be very politically difficult at the moment.
Absolutely. Christian, you also wanted to add something, and maybe while speaking about the mechanism, you also can add up why this tribunal is so important in the European context for other European countries.
First of all, we're talking about values here, and the European nations of the Western Hemisphere, we share the same values, and we are to defend the values. But you have to look at how the world is developing right now. The world is moving eastward, not westward. The Western influence is relatively being weakened, and the Eastern is being stronger. And also, Putin knows that, and Putin knows that when he started this war, I don't think he was surprised about the European response or the American response. I think he expected that. It happened a little faster than he expected, but I think he expected it. But he knew he had China. He just signed a great agreement with China just 2 weeks before, right after the Olympics. And this was a cooperation with no limits. That was the term. Of course, he knew that China would not criticize automatically this war. And also, he knows that there are other countries. India is a huge country. Not being very active against this war. And if you add up all the population of the world, I think it's 1/3 is being actually criticizing this war. Hundreds of millions are just saying nothing about this war. And most people actually couldn't care less about this war. Actually, if you look at Latin America or South America, if you look at Africa, and also countries in Africa is actually not voting in the UN against this war, and because Russia has interest there, and they know that the economic interest for Russia and then Russia is great. So it's the rationality behind all what we do, which is morally right. They have different morals. If you don't like these morals, they have other morals. So I think we should be aware of that. And when you talk about, if you listen to a podcast which was in Aftenposten, it's just being issued. It was about a woman in Russia, 6 years old, 4 sons, and she was saying that she supported Putin. She said that in the 90s, before the 90s, 1990, they were in the Cold War. They had education, they had the possibilities to have an apartment, they got food, and she said that's security for me. And now you have the oligarchs taking all the economic power in Russia. She feels that she's falling out, and she's looking backwards to the 90s or the Cold War era. That doesn't help Ukraine anything, but just saying that how they're being rational in Russia is very different from how they're being rational in the Western world, and as we look at what's right and what's not. And the last point is that to go back to the Holodomor and in the 30s, in the 32, 33, I'll recommend this book, by the way. I think you can compare looking at the Ukrainians as being less than human, and the Russian way they look at it, and it's just a way to... Ukraine is not a country. The Ukrainians actually working for Russia. Russia is they belong to Russia, and they look at Ukrainians as a group, and they're actually trying there at the 32, 33 to actually collectivize and actually force them out through starvation. And I think that's genocide in my terms. And when you look at our proposal in Parliament calling Holodomor a genocide, which now we got a letter from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying that they could not do that because they're saying that it happened before 1945 because you had different rules before that. You cannot call it genocide. They also said that they could not go alone saying this is a genocide, which is also a mistake because 20 countries are already termed this as a genocide according to, and also the European Parliament. So we are very disappointed by the response, and hopefully they will look different if the Ukrainian representatives here and the one who supports Ukraine can also go to the government and saying, here, you have a chance now to actually term this as a genocide.
Mm-hmm. We have gone a little bit ahead of our agenda here and started speaking about Holodomor, but this was an extremely important point here. We will come back to it. But at the moment, if you just remember what Anton Korinevich spoke about in his speech, he spoke about two important gaps. So now we spoke a little bit about political justice and bringing at least Russian elites to justice in the context of this war, but also another gap concerning the mechanism for compensations. Would you maybe also say a few words about that, how you think we can overcome this problem, and if there are any mechanisms which already exist that can be used for making this process more effective? Who would like to start?
Okay, I will start. You know, because in Ukraine we exactly understood both easily Ukrainian and Russian language, Ukrainians usually check what exactly discuss Russians in Russian internet, and sometimes they have this really popular narrative that Russians now destroyed in Ukrainian all that before they built, how they call it, during the Soviet Union time, all of this industrial object like Azovstal, all of this electricity system, they told about, we build it, we take it back. Yeah, it's one of result of propaganda. It's exactly a question about psychological problems, but it's situation now when we understood that we don't need exactly money to rebuild all what we have before. We can use this moment exactly with recovery to modernize our systems of industry, of providing heating, providing electricity or something like this. So, and in this way, we see this like opportunities. That's why so important this national level to organize and like coordinate all of the process of recovery. And second one, it's local governments. Here, like I'm really glad to be in different comunas now and look how strong exactly local government existing here. I think it's good opportunity to us teach exactly studying how it's going here in Norway and do it same in Ukraine, because we only started in 2019. We have a decentralization reform. So second level, it will be this local government decision and take a part in this regional plan of recovery. But last one, it's exactly personal recovery, because whole the population of Ukraine suffering because of war crimes, but exist people who exactly lose whole their properties. Exist people who lose whole their businesses, whole the opportunity, and sometimes few generations who manage some properties like lose it because of shelling or because they need to, like internally displaced because of some threats. So these three levels, that means, and we really want that not first of all, many of our friends and partners, we use it for that. And for that, we first of all need to use Russian monies. So because it's not your like fault that Russian exactly start the war. And not your money, not your taxes need to be first, like, we really appreciate for such supporting, but first of all, it needs to be using Russian monies. And Russian monies, it's exactly digging in each European system of economic. You can find it everywhere. You need just to look, you need just to investigate it. And I think it's help to a lot of European countries' financial control systems exactly be more strong. After you find how Russians exactly use your economic for hiding their corrupt money, because it's money of population which use it by usually authorities. That's one, like at the end, one short anecdote about my conversation with authority of Switzerland, when they told about, when asking about, okay, you find a lot of Russian money, so what kind of solutions you have to manage it? They say, oh, at the beginning we need to separate corrupt money and money of common order Russians, which exactly have accounting in Switzerland banks. Sorry? Which exactly order, like common Russians can open the Switzerland bank account? Is it impossible? It's too expensive for any common order Russians. So this really need to understood that inside the Russia, it's not exist really fair economic rules. So you need to account it when you look at the Russian money, which exactly now exists in European economic system.
Yeah. Would you like also to elaborate a little bit? Yes.
Yes, and I think more important than to have, let's say, money for building a reconstructed society is the cultural collapse that they are trying to build. I think it's much more important to discuss that. I think it's a practical challenge, and I think that we try not to look at revenge, saying that I need the Russian money. It's fine. I think if the world community, at least of the people who believe in these values, we can also being there to contribute to rebuild the Ukraine, and some of the money that the government now has decided with a unison parliament almost to also put money into salaries for people working in Ukraine, if there are nurses or teachers and so on. That is also a rebuilding society. But what you now to look at now, when they actually force children to move from Ukraine into Russia, actually to Russify them or something we'll call that, and also destroy churches, these cultural identities, which is very important to Ukraine. All the other things I think we can solve, and it will be solved, because money is not the solution, and money is just a tool to make it better. So I think that's important, because you also have to look at the world. I thought, as Jens Stoltenberg was saying, that if you have more trade and more better standard of living, there will be peace. And I believe that, and I was really surprised when the war started, because the Russian economy is actually doing better than they did many, many years ago in the Cold War, and Ukraine also was on the rise. And if you look at China, they're getting richer and richer, but they're getting more dangerous for every day that passes by. And so it's actually an illusion, and then culture, identity, ethnicity, it's more important than money in this case. I think you should be very much aware of that.
Thank you. Sophia?
I think for me, it's we have to separate two kinds of compensation. The first is general aid to rebuild Ukraine, currently during the war, but also, of course, after the war. That's one form of compensation package, and that's what you were a part of passing in the parliament just last week. The other hand is victim compensation. So direct compensation for persons who have been victimized or are family members of victims of persons who have died, from a war crime or in genocide, or have been the victims of other forms of war crimes, such as displacement of children. I would classify that as a war crime. Now, international criminal law isn't as experienced with that as they are with prosecutions. I think there was more of a focus in the 90s on the prosecution element of it. Now there's been somewhat more focus on victim compensation. The last 10 or 20 years, the ICC is working on this now. But I think that this sort of comes back to, I think, a key point that I think is important to always underline when we're talking about international criminal justice, and that is that a lot of these mechanisms, in order for them to work, have to be closely tied to the local level, right? So we're not going to be able to have, the ICC will not be prosecuting all of these cases, right? They'll probably only be prosecuting maybe 1% of perpetrators, if not 0.001%. Most of the cases are going to be done probably from a more domestic perspective. And that's important because victims cannot really participate in a process in The Hague. Most victims will not be able to do that, right? Which is why I think why international criminal law has learned over the last 20 or 30 years that being more tied to a domestic context is important, because it's about these other mechanisms that a trial represents, about victims having actual access to those proceedings, and not just as witnesses, but also from a reconciliation perspective and also from a compensation perspective. And I think that the key will be in how to make fairly simple applications and procedures available to victims that they can apply to as part of these prosecutions domestically that are not going to be overly bureaucratic. Because it doesn't have to be the case that your perpetrator has to be in prison or found guilty for you to get compensation, because at the end of the day, most perpetrators, or a lot of perpetrators, are not going to be prosecuted. And so you kind of have to decouple those two things as well. And that, I think, is going to be important to create a sort of separate mechanism for handling the level of applications which will come from victim groups, because I do think that's really important. And it doesn't have to necessarily be the biggest sums. They've done this in Cambodia, and it hasn't been the biggest sums, but it's a really important symbolic value that we see that you've been a victim, direct victim of this, and therefore you're entitled to some compensation. How that's going to be funded is going to depend on how this war, where we're going to be in 5 or 6 years. But I think that gap is definitely there, and something that needs to be worked on alongside creating these good tribunal mechanisms for doing a lot of the prosecutions in practice.
But in any case, what is important is that we started speaking about it early enough in order to see different solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, to speak about holding the aggressor accountable is very important because, as you have heard already, this war is not the only tragedy in Ukrainian history. Now, I would like you to watch a video comment from Tomasz Lachowski, a Polish lawyer and journalist, editor-in-chief of the Polish magazine and portal, International Observer, and lecturer at the University of Łódź, and he will draw historical parallels 90 years back in time, from the current war to the Great Famine of 1932-1933. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear organizers, distinguished guests, all people of Norway and Ukraine and other states that unconditionally support Ukrainians in their struggle for independence and sovereignty against the Russian aggressor. It's an honor and privilege for me to take part in such important event with my humble contribution. Today, we discuss the possible legal means that can be applied in order to bring to justice all Russian perpetrators of the crimes that are still being committed on the Ukrainian soil and against the Ukrainian nation. Such crimes as the crime of aggression, genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity are being committed in the name of an imperial and totalitarian ideology of the Kremlin, the Russian world, Ruski Mir. However, it is nothing new in the history of Moscow. Today's contemporary genocide shall be compared to the Soviet Union's repressions against the Ukrainian nation, with the symbolic but also extremely real the crime of the Holodomor, the Great Famine of 1932 and 1933. The Great Famine, that is the man-made artificial famine organized by Joseph Stalin, Vyacheslav Molotov, and other people belonging to the closest leadership of the Soviet Union, created in order to suppress the Ukrainian nation and its resistance. More than 4 million people, namely the Ukrainian peasants, were exterminated due to the implementation of this horrific ideology of the Homo Sovieticus. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish lawyer of Jewish origin, a person who coined the term genocide in international law, in his famous speech of 1953, delivered in New York for the 20th anniversary of the Great Famine, he named the Great Famine, the Holodomor, as the most classic example of the Soviet genocide in the history. Although Lemkin did not limit the genocide for those 2 tragic years of the artificial famine itself. Lemkin talked about the Soviet genocide as a long-lasting process that started with the first blow against the Ukrainian intellectuals in the late 1920s, then the repressions against an Orthodox, autocephalic, independent Ukrainian church, then the the Holodomor itself against the Ukrainian farmers, which in fact during those days were an emanation of the Ukrainian nations. Those 3 steps were supplemented by the 4th one, that is the resettlement of south and east of Ukraine, those territories that suffered most from the Great Famine by the people of different nationalities and ethnicities, including the Russian ethnical group. Lemkin has delivered his speech in 1953 during the time when the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of 1948 has already entered into force, which happened in 1951. For Lemkin, it was not just an academic discussion. It was an argument based on the convention itself, especially having in mind a special intent observed in order to destroy the Ukrainian national group. The recognition of the Holodomor by Norway and other states belonging to the international community today is not just a simple political decision. It is a decision that can bring the historical justice for the Ukrainian nation and the victims of the Soviet genocide, mainly based on the content of the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, that is the legal binding treaty. Moreover, the recognition of the Holodomor is also a very significant step in order to overcome the culture of impunity in which the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation have lasted for many decades. Today's genocide, a physical and biological genocide, which is supplemented by cultural and political genocide that can be used in the light of the convention as a possible mean of the reconstruction of an intent of the perpetrator of the crime of genocide, is just a next step of the totalitarian and imperial policy of the Kremlin. The decision to recognize the Holodomor as a genocide is not just about history, it's also about today's situation and the Ukrainian struggle for freedom and for the situation in which they can survive, simply survive as an independent nation. This decision is extremely significant from the legal and political, but also social and even psychological point of view. Thank you for your kind attention.
And I suggest that we just take concluding remarks as a response to comment from Tomasz. Maybe, if you don't mind, you can elaborate a little bit on this relation between political and historical justice, and why historical justice is important for Ukraine as well. Who would like to start? Very short, if we can do that. So,
I can do so.
Yeah. Please.
What I was listening to, what he was saying, like that, it's the least we can do. It's not just about interpreting history, it's about supporting Ukraine right now and Ukrainians right now. It doesn't cost us anything, even though it should do it if it costs us anything, but it doesn't cost us anything. And also the argument saying that, well, it isn't just the Ukrainians that was hurt by Stalin's policies, it was also the Russians themselves. Well, it has nothing to do with it. It's, if you look at World War II, you'll say, well, it was a genocide against the Jews, but you said that even though the gypsies and the sexual minorities was also killed, but still it was a genocide against the Jews. And you can look at the same at Rwanda with the Hutus and Tutsis, you can also say the same there. It's not ethnicities that was dividing them, and just the ethnicities that was dividing them. And I think for us to support these 2-3 million Ukrainians that will starve to death, by collectivization and also having the ideology. We can criticize the ideology, and I think most people do, but I think we should recognize this as in honor of Ukrainian and what they experienced the last year.
Thank you. Sophia?
I think that it's really important. I think this is such a seismic event. I think that for our generation, it's really going to be a defining event, what's happening now. And I think it's an opportunity for us to reflect on who we want to be in this larger picture. And I think for me, it's a question of looking at, there are obviously going to be questions of looking at historical events differently or labeling them, being clearer about what they were. It's also a question of, I'm a big believer in thinking about what can I do, what can we concretely do? Because right now it can seem very difficult to think, what can we actually do with what's happening right now? And I think it's making that long-term commitment that justice might take a long time. But it is, as again, I do believe that in a long-term perspective, justice here is possible, and that means a long-term commitment, both politically, financially, but also from a legal perspective. I think that, Norway has played an important role in international criminal justice before. I hope we continue to do so. And I think for European countries who, like Norway, who haven't ratified the Kampala amendments, we have not been bound by the crime of aggression ourselves. We're not one of the countries who've decided to adopt that amendment to the ICC. I think we have to decide if we are saying those are the rules of the game, we also have to walk that talk by being bound by that from an international criminal perspective. So I think upholding international law and fortifying it where there are gaps is also part of the bigger picture that we can actually do something about right now.
Thank you. Sasha?
I have so many arguments. I'm trying to, choose a few. First of all, we have, that one of Nobel laureate have a prize because they create understanding of natural experiment. Because in that moment when we have this artificial, exactly suffering, artificial hunger in Ukraine, we have part of Ukraine who in that moment was not controlled by Soviet Union, was controlled by Austro-Hungarian, exactly, territory and Poland. So that's why we know that its conditions in whole the territory of Ukraine was same, but in this part which Soviet Union control, that artificial hunger exactly killed a lot of people. And this exactly control group, so Ukrainians who was not controlled by Soviet Union at that moment, this control group in our natural experiment show that people which family gives you understanding that such artificial hunger can be, that it's possible that your state do that against of you because Soviet Union told that we are your state and we do that against of you. Group people who don't have this memory in their families, more active and more prepared to fight for democracy, for rights, and exactly it's like our first people who coming and create our first revolution in 1991, which we call Revolution in the Stone. That was a student from there. So, and they keep a lot of memories because this artificial hunger gives not only physical death, but huge scaring, huge fear, which exactly going through generation by generation, that if you will resist, like state will crush you. So it's 1 second. Genocide, it's exactly international crime. International crime don't have a date of issues. So it's this question that convention was after that artificial hunger going, it's not work here. And because of Russia Federation exactly covered the archive and don't give the possibility recognize it officially, they exactly close all the archive by NKVD and KGB or all of the previous secret services. So this, and they denied that that was special made by decision of state. So it's continuing crimes. It's still continuing crimes. So in this way, as for me, from law way, we don't have any arguments not do that it was before convention or something like this. But it's really need to understand that same like sexual crimes during the war. It's a tool to broke the generation exactly will to take responsible, to answer for some autocracy tools and methods of manage the country. So yeah, okay, I choose these three.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, history teaches us that the evil that was not properly condemned rises again and again. Had there been enough knowledge, memory, and recognition for the for the crimes committed by first the Soviet and afterwards the Russian regime against Ukraine, probably Russia would not dare to start this terrible war. It's very difficult to believe that 90 years after the genocide, after the Great Famine, the Holodomor, Ukrainians are still denied to be an independent nation. They are still denied the right to be themselves, to have their own identity, and to follow their European values, which are common for all of us. And the full-scale Russian invasion, which started a year ago, has become a kind of culmination of this kind of injustices throughout 20th and 21st century. And it allowed the world to see the criminal nature of the Russian political regime, and that it does not hesitate to use genocide as a means of achieving its geopolitical goals. So what is important for us now is to understand that political justice comes hand in hand with historical justice, and I hope that we will be able to achieve both of them. Thank you very much for being with us, and over to you, Ingvild, now.
Thank you. And thank you, Natalia, for moderating the discussion so cunningly, and thank you to the panel. Thank you very much. Before we end today, I want to give the floor back to Lilia Honcharevich from the Ukrainian Embassy for some final remarks.
Thank you, Ingvild. So 24th of February became the day of our unity around the victory. And the world is united around the victory of Ukraine today more than ever. I would like to thank each of you at your place for solidarity with Ukraine and your dedication to bring those responsible to accountability. Accountability is a key to restore the justice and prevail the world from future wars and genocides. Thus, I would like to thank the people without whom this event would not be possible. First of all, I would like to thank Oleksandra for this inspirational push for the whole Ukrainian nation to get the Nobel Peace Prize in the times of war, and thus I would like to award you with the certificate of appreciation. And also some historical sign that you will sure know about it. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Here is it. Thank you. And I would like also to thank, of course, the co-organizers without whom this event would not be possible. So I would like to thank the director of the Nobel Peace Center, Kerstin. Thank you so much. And of course to have this blue and yellow strip, and also to have the very symbolic for Ukraine. This is like in colors of Ukraine, and I hope you will like it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And I would like also to thank the Christian for really the symbolic thing and for the opening the possibility of discussion, the recognition of Holodomor on the national level. And I do hope that we will change together the opinion of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Norway, because as it looks right now, so all the 23 countries that recognize Holodomor as a genocide, including lately Germany, didn't know about the Convention of 1948. So that's why I would like to award you with the opener, with a very traditional good evening. We are from Ukraine, that is very traditional from Ukraine, and this is the opener for the discussion in the parliament. And of course, this is symbolic thing. So you can use in this sorting, and as well the certificate of appreciation. And the Ukrainian calendar, so you can also have on your wall. Thank you. Thank you. And I would like also to thank the Ministry of Justice and the Norwegian government for all the solidarity and all the efforts to help Ukraine and to stand with Ukraine. Astrid? Here is something on your wall and also the national symbol of Ukraine. Thank you a lot. The way forward for Ukraine and for the whole democratic world is to stop being afraid of Russian nuclear blackmail. In order to reach the peace, we need, among other important things, heavy weapon. We need it right now. We need recognition of genocide, launch of the special tribunal to restore the justice, and many more. We have a lot of work in front of us, and we would appreciate the contribution of each of you at your place to make sure that this year will become the year of the victory of Ukraine and the victory of all the democratic world. Glory to Ukraine. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you so much, Lilia, and thank you to the Ukrainian Embassy and the University of Oslo. And thank you all for coming.